The crowd in Las Vegas didn't know. They saw the lights, the rhinestones, the smile, the voice that still filled the room like a promise. But that night, Elvis Presley stepped on stage with a feeling he couldn't explain, a quiet, terrifying certainty that something inside him wasn't right. And the most frightening part? He didn't stop the show. He finished it. Stay until the end, because this story isn't about a performance. It's about the moment Elvis realized his body had started keeping secrets from him, and he kept singing anyway. Elvis felt it before anyone could see it. Not pain, exactly. Not the kind of sharp alarm that forces you to sit down or call for help. It was subtler than that, a strange internal shift, like a switch in his body had flipped into a mode he didn't recognize. He stood in the dressing room under the mirror lights, watching his own reflection, and something about his face looked wrong. Not older, not tired, wrong. His eyes were heavy in a way that didn't match the day. His skin looked too pale under the warm bulbs, and his breathing, though controlled, was a fraction deeper than usual, as if his chest needed more oxygen to do less work. Elvis pressed 2 fingers against his wrist, pretending he was checking something simple. The pulse was there, steady enough, but it felt loud, insistent. Someone outside the door laughed. Crew voices moved down the hallway. The building did what it always did before a show. Rushed, prepared, pretended everything was normal. Elvis tried to join that normal. He adjusted his collar, smoothed the fabric of his jumpsuit, checked the scarf at his neck. Every motion was familiar, rehearsed. He had done this so many times that his hands could prepare the king even when his mind felt far away. A knock came at the door. 5 minutes, E. Elvis nodded, though no one could see it. When the door closed again, the room felt too quiet. Quiet always made the truth louder. Elvis sat down, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He focused on his breathing the way he had learned to do when pressure started building behind his ribs. Inhale, hold, exhale. Slow down. Don't let the body control the mind. But something was different tonight. Tonight, the mind couldn't negotiate. He stood again, and the room tilted slightly, not enough to make him stumble, but enough to make him freeze. Elvis gripped the edge of the vanity for a second, forcing himself to smile at the mirror like it was just nerves. He had felt nerves before. This wasn't nerves. It was like his body was carrying a message it refused to translate into language, a warning without words, a sensation that made him want to step away from the door, away from the stage, away from everything that demanded he be invincible. Elvis swallowed. The thought came, quiet but undeniable. What if I can't do this tonight? He hated that question, not because it made him weak, but because it was logical. He had pushed past his limits too many times to count. He had learned to treat the body like a vehicle. Refill it, medicate it, command it forward. If it protested, you overruled it. If it trembled, you steadied it. If it begged, you ignored it. The show always came first, because the show was bigger than him. He heard footsteps return outside the door. Another knock, firmer. 2 minutes. Elvis stood still, eyes locked on his reflection. For a moment, he didn't see the jumpsuit or the hair or the face everyone recognized. He saw a man under pressure, a man who had survived so many nights by pretending survival was effortless. He reached into his pocket and touched something small, not even important, just a habit. A ring, a folded note, the kind of object people use to feel grounded when they don't trust the ground anymore. The room tilted again, just slightly. Elvis took one slow step, then another, proving to himself that his legs still listened. He moved toward the door, and as his hand closed around the handle, another sensation hit him, a tightness in his chest, brief, like someone squeezing the air out of him for just a second. It passed quickly. That was the danger. If it had lasted, he would have had to admit it was real. Because it passed, he could pretend it was nothing. Elvis opened the door. The hallway light was harsher than the mirror lights, and the noise of backstage movement rushed in like a wave. People looked at him with the same familiar expectation. Not curiosity, not concern, but certainty. Elvis Presley was about to go on stage. That was all they needed to believe. He walked forward, each step measured. He could hear the band warming up, feel the building vibrate with anticipation. The crowd was already roaring in the distance, a sound that used to energize him automatically. Tonight, it sounded far away. Elvis reached the edge of the stage entrance, where the light changed from backstage yellow to stage white brilliance. He paused for half a breath, the way fighters do before stepping into a ring. Someone near him said, "You're gonna kill him tonight." Elvis nodded faintly, but inside, the warning returned. Not louder, not clearer, just more persistent. Something is wrong. The curtain shifted. The lights hit him, and Elvis stepped into them anyway. The first note came out clean. That alone almost convinced him everything was fine. Elvis felt a familiar surge as the sound carried across the room, filling the space the way it always had. The band locked in immediately. The crowd responded on instinct, rising to him like a wave that had been waiting all night to break. For a brief moment, the warning receded. This was the dangerous part, because the voice still worked. That's how Elvis had survived so many nights before. By trusting that if the voice obeyed, the rest of him would follow. He moved forward, taking his place at the center of the stage, shoulders back, posture confident. From the outside, the performance looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. Inside, it wasn't keeping up. By the second song, Elvis noticed a delay. Not a mistake, not a slip, a lag. His mind knew where his body needed to be a split second before his body arrived there. His steps felt heavier, as if gravity had quietly increased without warning. When he turned, the motion carried an unfamiliar resistance, like pushing through thick air. He compensated automatically. Shorter movements, less flourish. He leaned more into the microphone stand than usual, letting it anchor him. The audience didn't notice. They never did. They saw intention where Elvis felt adjustment. Between verses, he swallowed hard. His mouth felt dry in a way that water wouldn't fix. He signaled subtly for a towel, wiped his face, smiled at the front rows as if the sweat meant passion instead of strain. The lights were hotter than he remembered. Or maybe he was. He gathered under the jumpsuit, trapped, clinging. His chest tightened again, not sharply, not enough to stop him, just enough to make each breath feel shallow, like it had to be earned. Elvis listened to his own voice carefully now, not for pitch or power, but for signs. Weakness, breaks, anything that would force him to stop. The voice held. That scared him more than if it hadn't, because it meant he could keep going. And keeping going had always been his most dangerous talent. He moved into the next song, one that demanded more control, more breath. Halfway through the first chorus, Elvis felt a brief wave of dizziness ripple through him. Not spinning, just a momentary sense that the stage had shifted position without telling him. He tightened his grip on the microphone. The audience roared louder, mistaking tension for intensity. Someone screamed his name. Another voice cried out something he couldn't quite make out. Elvis smiled. The smile felt slower than usual, like it took extra effort to assemble. He thought briefly about stopping, not dramatically, just pausing the show, taking a breath, letting the band carry the moment while he regrouped. The thought lasted less than a second. Stopping would raise questions. Questions would become concern. Concern would become control. And Elvis had spent his life learning how to avoid that chain reaction. So he adjusted again. He stood more still now, conserving energy, letting the songs do the heavy lifting. He leaned into the familiar structures, the phrasing he could deliver even if his mind went blank, the gestures that had become muscle memory. But even muscle memory was slower tonight. Between songs, he turned slightly toward the band, pretending to cue them, using the moment to take a deeper breath. His lungs didn't feel empty. They felt inefficient, like they weren't exchanging air the way they should. He pressed his tongue briefly against the roof of his mouth, grounding himself. "You're fine," he told himself. "You've been fine before." But the difference was undeniable. Before, exhaustion had come after the show. Tonight, it was on stage with him. Elvis felt a flicker of irritation. Not at the audience, not at the band, but at his own body. He had asked so much of it for so long that its quiet rebellion felt almost personal. Not now, he thought. Just get through this. The show moved forward relentlessly. Song after song, applause blurring into sound instead of meaning. Elvis noticed he had stopped enjoying the crowd and started monitoring himself instead, checking posture, breathing, balance. That was new. Performing used to make him forget his body. Tonight, it made him hyper-aware of it. As he reached the midpoint of the set, Elvis realized something unsettling. He wasn't afraid of collapsing. He was afraid of not knowing how close he was. Because nothing was failing loudly enough to force a decision. Everything was failing quietly. He glanced briefly toward the side of the stage, where familiar faces watched him closely. Their expressions were unreadable from this distance, but Elvis wondered if they saw what he felt: the slight stiffness, the restrained movement, the effort behind the control. The crowd cheered again. Elvis lifted the microphone and responded on instinct, voice rising, filling the room as if nothing inside him had changed. And that was the most dangerous illusion of all, because as long as the show continued, everyone would assume he was fine, including him. The first mistake was so small it barely qualified as one. Elvis missed a cue, not the band's, but his own. A half step late on a turn he had executed thousands of times. To the audience, it looked like a stylistic pause, a deliberate choice. Someone even cheered louder, mistaking hesitation for dramatic timing. Elvis felt it immediately. That was the difference. The second mistake followed shortly after. A breath taken too late, forcing him to shorten a line he usually stretched with ease. The note landed, but it didn't bloom the way it should have. He compensated with volume, pushing power where control had slipped. The crowd roared. Approval came easily. Effort went unnoticed. That frightened him. Elvis realized he had crossed into dangerous territory, the place where performance still worked, but the cost was no longer visible from the outside. Where mistakes were absorbed by charisma, masked by reputation. He had lived there before, but never like this. His body was no longer negotiating quietly. It was issuing small refusals, delayed responses, heavier limbs, shallow breath, each one subtle enough to ignore on its own. Together, they formed a pattern he couldn't dismiss anymore. Between songs, Elvis felt a tremor in his left hand, barely perceptible. He closed his fingers slowly, then opened them again, testing control the way a pilot tests instruments mid-flight. Still functional. That was the problem. He remembered something a doctor had once said to him, casually, almost as an afterthought. The body doesn't always fail loudly. Sometimes it fails politely. That sentence came back to him now, unwelcome and precise. Elvis adjusted again. He shortened the set transitions, spoke less between songs, let the band carry more of the momentum. He stayed closer to the microphone stand, using it as an anchor, disguising reliance as style. The lights fell harsher with every passing minute. Sweat pooled beneath the collar of his jumpsuit, but not in the way it usually did. This wasn't exertion alone. It was heat without release, pressure trapped inside. He swallowed again. His throat felt thick, not sore, just resistant. He took a sip of water between songs and nearly gagged when it went down too fast. He recovered quickly, lifting his head, smiling, turning the moment into a joke the audience never realized they'd missed. Inside, something tightened further. Elvis began to calculate. How many songs left? Which ones required the least movement? Where he could stand still without it looking intentional. This wasn't performance anymore. It was triage. The band followed him expertly, adjusting to his subtle signals, unaware of what they were compensating for. From their perspective, this was just another night with a slightly different rhythm. From Elvis's perspective, it felt like time was compressing. Moments blurred together. Applause became noise instead of feedback. Faces in the front rows lost definition, merging into light and movement. He caught himself staring too long at one point in the distance, grounding himself by fixing on something stable. When he blinked, the world snapped back into place. That was close, he thought. He forced his posture straighter, reminding his body who was in charge. He had done this before. He could do it again. But the thought lacked conviction. Elvis realized then that he wasn't afraid of collapse on stage. He was afraid of what would happen after, of the doors that would close, the decisions others would make for his own good, the control that would descend the moment he admitted weakness. So he kept singing. Another song ended. Another roar of approval. The illusion held. But Elvis knew better now. The mistakes were no longer accidental. They were warnings. And the most dangerous thing about them was that no one was clapping for the moments when he nearly lost control. They were clapping for the moments he hit it best. As he moved into the final stretch of the show, Elvis felt something settle into place. A grim clarity. He could finish the performance. But he didn't know what finishing would cost him this time. By the time Elvis reached the final stretch of the set, he knew something irreversible had happened. Not a collapse. Not a failure. A crossing. There was a moment earlier in his career, many moments, really, when he could push through anything and feel the body recover as soon as the lights dimmed. Pain faded. Breath returned. Control reasserted itself. Tonight felt different. Tonight, the body wasn't promising recovery. It was demanding acknowledgement. Elvis stood center stage, microphone in hand, the band easing into another familiar opening. The crowd cheered reflexively, trained by years of memory and expectation. From their perspective, this was just another peak moment. The king delivering exactly what he always did. Inside, Elvis felt his chest tighten again, deeper this time. Not sharp enough to stop him outright, but heavy enough to make every inhale feel borrowed. He shifted his weight slightly, and his right leg hesitated, just a fraction of a second before responding. The delay was subtle, invisible to anyone else. To Elvis, it felt enormous. He realized then that he was no longer choosing to continue. Momentum had taken over, and momentum didn't care about limits. He sang the next verse carefully, controlling volume instead of power, shaping phrases to conserve air. His voice still carried, but required more concentration now, as if singing had become a calculation rather than an instinct. The band watched him closely. Someone near the side of the stage leaned forward, attention sharpened. Elvis caught the glance and immediately adjusted his posture, straightening, smiling, signaling with a nod that everything was fine. The lie came easily. That scared him more than the symptoms, because it meant he had rehearsed this moment his entire life, the art convincing others he was unbreakable. The heat under the lights intensified. Sweat blurred his vision briefly, forcing him to blink harder than usual. When his eyes refocused, the crowd looked flatter somehow, like a painted backdrop rather than a living sea of faces. Elvis anchored himself again, feet planted wider, shoulders squared. He could feel his heart pounding now, not erratically, but insistently, like it was working harder than it should have been allowed to. Finish the show, he told himself. Just finish it. That thought had always carried him through. But tonight, it carried a question behind it. And then what? He glanced toward the wings of the stage again, where familiar faces stood frozen between admiration and concern. Elvis wondered if they felt the shift too, the way the energy had changed from celebration to vigilance. The song ended. Applause thundered. Elvis bowed slightly, slower than usual, careful not to move too fast. The crowd interpreted it as drama. They loved it. That was the cruelty of it. The closer he came to the edge, the louder they cheered. Elvis knew he was past the point where ignoring the warning was harmless. Every instinct in him now said the same thing his pride refused to accept. This show could not end the way it started. He had to get off that stage. Not later. Not after one more song. Now, the realization didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as clarity. Elvis raised his hand slightly, signaling to band in a way only they would understand. The tempo shifted subtly, preparing for a closing he hadn't planned. The musicians followed without question, professionals trained to trust him even when they didn't understand why. He stepped closer to the microphone, steadying himself for the final words. His breath felt shallow, but his voice held, just barely. "Thank you," he said, his tone warm, sincere. "You've been real good to me tonight." The crowd erupted again, unaware that the ending had just been rewritten. Elvis smiled, nodded once more, then turned deliberately toward the side of the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last. He reached the edge, the lights fading behind him as the curtain shifted. The moment his foot crossed into backstage shadow, his body faltered, not collapsing, but swaying just enough to force him to grab the nearest support. Hands reached out immediately. Elvis He waved them off with a small motion, more reflex than strength. "I'm okay," he said, but the words felt thin. The show was over, and the truth he had avoided all night finally had room to breathe. The moment the curtain closed, the world went quiet in a way Elvis wasn't prepared for. Not peaceful, not relieving, exposing. Backstage lighting was softer, more forgiving, but it did nothing to hide the way his body responded once the performance stopped demanding obedience. The adrenaline that had carried him to the final minutes drained too quickly, leaving behind a heaviness that settled into his limbs like wet sand. Elvis leaned forward instinctively, hands braced on his thighs, breathing slower now, not calmer, but more deliberate. Each inhale felt like it had to travel farther to reach where it was needed. Someone offered him water. Another asked if he wanted to sit. Voices overlapped, concern tightening their edges. "I'm fine," Elvis said automatically. The words came out before he considered them. Reflex, habit, armor. He lowered himself onto a chair anyway, movements careful, economical. Sitting down felt less like rest and more like surrender, and that frightened him. For years, sitting after a show had meant relief. Tonight, it felt like admitting something had slipped. He wiped his face with a towel, hand shaking just enough that he noticed, and hid it by tightening his grip. The dressing room door closed behind him, sealing off the noise of the arena. The silence inside the room was thick, uncomfortable. No applause, no music, no momentum, just the body. Elvis leaned back and closed his eyes, listening to his own heartbeat. It sounded louder now, uneven in his ears, like it was working overtime to compensate for something else that wasn't. The warning returned, stronger now, undeniable. Not pain, wrongness. He pressed a hand against his chest, not in panic, but in curiosity, as if checking whether something had moved out of place while he wasn't looking. For the first time that night, the thought surfaced fully formed. What if I shouldn't have finished? The question sat there, heavy, unanswerable. Because finishing had always been the right thing to do. Finishing was professionalism, responsibility, strength. But tonight, finishing felt reckless. Elvis thought about the moment on stage when he knew he needed to stop. The clarity that had arrived just before he ignored it. He remembered the ease with which he had smiled, bowed, reassured everyone that nothing was wrong. That ease disturbed him. It meant he had become very good at lying about his limits. Someone knocked softly on the door, then stepped in without waiting. "You scared us," they said gently. Elvis didn't respond right away. He stared at the mirror, at the reflection that looked composed enough to be convincing. He wondered how many times he had trusted that image over his own sensations. "I didn't want to disappoint anyone," he said finally. The admission surprised even him. The person in the room didn't argue. They didn't reassure him with platitudes. They just nodded. "That's not the same as taking care of yourself," they said quietly. Elvis swallowed. He had spent his life equating those two things. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was contemplative. The kind that forces honesty to the surface, whether you want it or not. Elvis realized then that the show hadn't been the test. The test was this moment. What he would do now, once the lights were gone and no one was watching closely enough to be fooled. He could dismiss it, call it fatigue, take something to push the feeling away, promise himself it wouldn't happen again. He had done all of that before. Or he could acknowledge that tonight hadn't been a fluke. It had been a signal. Elvis leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. His breathing was steadier now, but the heaviness remained. It didn't feel urgent anymore. It felt patient, waiting. The idea unsettled him more than panic ever could. He looked up at the mirror one last time, studying his own eyes, not for weakness, but for truth. The truth was simple and terrifying. His body had been asking for help for a long time. Tonight was just the first time he couldn't ignore it completely. Elvis woke up expecting the feeling to be gone. That had always been the pattern. A show ended. The body protested. Sleep arrived in fragments, and morning brought a fragile reset. Not healing, exactly, but distance. Enough space to convince himself that whatever had happened belonged to the night before. This morning didn't cooperate. He opened his eyes slowly, already aware of the weight before he moved. It sat in his chest like a hell breath that had never been released. Not painful, not sharp, just present, persistent. The room was quiet, light slipping through the curtains in thin lines. Ordinary morning sounds filtered in, distant movement, the low hum of a house waking up. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. And yet, Elvis didn't sit up right away. He lay still, testing his body the way he had learned to do after difficult nights. Fingers first, then toes. A careful breath in, slower out. Everything responded, but reluctantly, like it was doing him a favor. That unsettled him more than resistance would have, because resistance meant boundaries. Reluctance meant negotiation. Elvis finally pushed himself upright, pausing on the edge of the bed longer than usual. A brief wave of dizziness passed through him, subtle enough to dismiss if he wanted to. He didn't. He waited until it cleared before standing. That, more than anything, told him the night hadn't ended when the curtain closed. It had followed him home. In the bathroom, the mirror reflected a man who looked composed enough to fool someone else. The signs were small, a dullness behind the eyes, a tightness around the mouth, a pallor that light couldn't soften. Elvis stared at himself longer than usual, not searching for reassurance this time, searching for honesty. He thought about the moment on stage when he'd known, truly known, that something wasn't right, the clarity that had arrived just before he ignored it, the ease with which he'd smiled through it, carried the illusion to its conclusion. Finishing the show hadn't fixed anything. It had delayed the reckoning. Elvis moved through the morning slowly. Coffee tasted wrong. Food held no appeal. His hands felt steady, but only because he was careful not to rush them. Every movement now carried intention, not performance, but preservation. He realized then that he had been mistaking endurance for health for a very long time. Endurance let you survive. Health required listening. And listening, he understood, was what he had avoided most. There were people he could call, doctors who would explain, advisors who would reassure, systems ready to intervene, to take control, to decide what came next. Elvis didn't reach for phone. Not yet. He needed to sit with the truth before anyone else framed it for him. He returned to a quiet room and sat down, hands resting on his thighs, breathing measured. The body still felt off, not failing, not stable. Somewhere in between, a warning zone. He thought about how many times he had overridden similar signals, how often he had treated the body like something to be managed rather than respected. Medication had softened edges. Schedules had distracted him. Applause had drowned out discomfort. But this time, the discomfort had stayed, because it wasn't asking for a night off. It was asking for change. Elvis felt something unfamiliar rise in him. Not fear, not anger. Responsibility. Not the kind imposed from the outside. The kind that comes when denial stops working. He understood then that the show he finished the night before hadn't been a victory or a failure. It had been a turning point disguised as professionalism. The danger wasn't collapsing on stage. The danger was continuing to believe that nothing had happened. Elvis leaned back, eyes closed, letting the realization settle fully. He didn't know what the next steps would be. Tests, rest, confrontations with limits he had avoided naming. All of that could come later. What mattered now was simpler. He would not treat this as nothing. He would not perform through it. And for the first time in a long time, Elvis allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by how much he could push, but by how well he could listen. The show had ended, but the message had finally been received, and that he knew might be the moment that saved him. If he didn't ignore it again,